My name is Alara Thorne, and though I am 45 years old now, a woman who has built a life on her own terms, the story I need to tell you begins when I was just 19. It starts on the day my own father, Sheriff Alistair Thorne, the most respected and feared man in our county, used me as bait to catch a ghost. He dressed me in silk and jewels and sent me into the dark heart of the Whisper Wood, hoping to lure the legendary highwayman they called the Shadow of the Pass. But the ghost my father was hunting wasn't the monster of the story. In a twist of fate I could never have imagined, the man I was meant to entrap was the only one trying to save my life. Before I dive into how a gilded cage became a death trap, and how a fearsome outlaw became my unlikely savior, I want to connect with all of you watching. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from today. It always means so much to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated or betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the newcomers, please consider subscribing to join this community of survivors and storytellers. Now, let's go back to that cold autumn morning when the fog clung to the windows of my father's house like a shroud, and my world was about to be torn apart. The air in the manor that morning was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. It was a silence I knew well, a heavy, waiting silence that fell whenever my father was orchestrating something of great importance. From my bedroom window, I watched the stable hands hitching the two finest black horses to the carriage, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The carriage itself was an ostentatious thing, lacquered wood polished to a mirror shine, with my family's modest crest painted on the door. It was the carriage we used for official visits, for parades, for displaying the proper image of the county sheriff's family. Today it was a trap, and I was the cheese. My father stood on the gravel drive below, a tall, unbending figure in his immaculate uniform. Alistair Thorne did not simply wear his authority, he inhabited it. It was in the rigid set of his shoulders, the clipped, precise way he gave orders, the cold blue eyes that assessed everything for its use, its weakness, or its value. For the past 6 months, his singular obsession had been the highwayman known as the Shadow. The man was more myth than reality, a figure who materialized from the fog on the Old North Road, relieving wealthy merchants and tax collectors of their burdens with an almost theatrical flair. He never harmed a soul, and rumor had it he distributed much of his takings to the poor families struggling under the thumb of the very merchants he robbed. To the common folk he was a hero. To my father he was a personal insult, a stain on his perfect record of order and control. Alara, a voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and laced with impatience. Beatrice, my stepmother, stood in my doorway. She was a woman carved from ice, beautiful in a severe way, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to tug at the corners of her eyes. She held a dress over her arm, a creation of deep emerald silk that must have cost a fortune. "Your father is waiting. You are to wear this." It wasn't a request. Nothing from Beatrice ever was. I had been 5 years old when my own mother, a woman of warmth and laughter and wildflower perfumes, had succumbed to a fever. A year later, my father married Beatrice. The light in our home had gone out, replaced by her chilling propriety and my father's increasing distance. He had once called me his little sparrow. Now he rarely looked at me at all, unless it was to note a failing in my posture or my needlework, usually prompted by a quiet word from Beatrice. I took the dress. The silk felt cold against my skin. "Why this dress?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It will be ruined if it rains." Beatrice's smile was a thin, bloodless line. "You must look the part, dear. A young lady of fortune, traveling to visit her ailing aunt. A tempting target. The Shadow, it is said, has an eye for quality." Her gaze flickered over me, dismissive and cold. She saw me not as a stepdaughter, but as a tool, a prop in her husband's grand play. A flawed prop at that. I was too much like my mother. The same soft brown hair, the same gentle eyes, a constant living reminder of the woman she had replaced. As I dressed, my hands trembled. This entire scheme felt wrong, a deep, discordant note in the symphony of my fear. My father had laid it all out for me the night before in his study, the fire casting long, dancing shadows that made his face seem like a mask. He'd spoken of duty, of civic pride. He'd said it was an honor, a chance for me to finally do something of substance. He planned to have his best deputies hidden along the pass, ready to spring the trap the moment the Shadow appeared. "The guards on your coach are the best I have," he'd assured me, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. "Grissom and Hawk, you will be perfectly safe. It is merely an appearance of vulnerability we require." But standing there, in a dress meant for a ball, about to be sent into the wilderness as bait, I did not feel safe. I felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, and the most terrifying part was that the shepherd was my own father. I remembered a time, long ago, when I'd fallen from a tree and scraped my knee. He had scooped me up, his hands surprisingly gentle, and told me he would never let anything bad happen to me. Where was that man now? Had he ever truly existed, or had I simply imagined him? I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror. A pale, frightened girl stared back, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't yet name. A part of me, a small screaming voice in the back of my mind, knew this was more than just a plan to catch a thief. It was something darker, something terrible, and I was walking right into the center of it. The journey began in silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the packed earth and the groaning complaint of the carriage's leather straps. Inside, the velvet seats felt plush and suffocating. The world outside the window was a smear of gray and deep green as we entered the looming maw of the Whisperwood. Ancient oaks and pines crowded the road, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense, gloomy canopy that sunlight struggled to pierce. A thick fog, common in these parts, coiled around the tree trunks like spectral serpents, deadening sound and shortening sight to a mere 20 feet. It was the perfect environment for a ghost to hunt. I sat alone, my hands clenched in the folds of the emerald silk. My father had insisted I ride without a handmaiden to heighten the illusion of vulnerability. Seated on the driver's box up front were Grissom and Hawk. Grissom was my father's right hand, a barrel-chested man with a perpetually florid face and small, cunning eyes that always seemed to be calculating. Hawk was younger, wiry, and quiet, a man who rarely spoke and never met my gaze directly. My father called them his best. I tried to calm the frantic beating of my heart by focusing on my memories of my mother. I conjured her face, the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners when she smiled. I remembered the scent of the rosewater she used, a scent Beatrice had immediately banished from the house after she arrived. My mother had loved this forest. She'd taught me the names of the wildflowers that grew in the dappled sunlight of its clearings and the calls of the birds that nested in its high branches. For her, it was a place of life and wonder. Today, for me, it was a place of dread. An hour bled into 2. The relentless rocking of the carriage was making me nauseous, the tension of physical weight pressing down on my chest. I thought about my father's face as he'd watched me depart. There was no flicker of concern, no fatherly worry. There was only the grim, focused intensity of a hunter setting a snare. And Beatrice? Beatrice had stood beside him, a faint, unreadable smile on her lips. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that was about to come to fruition. What had he promised her? A new carriage? More jewels? The public adoration that would come from a grateful county once the shadow was captured? It seemed a paltry sum for which to risk his only child. My thoughts were interrupted by a subtle shift in the rhythm of the carriage, a slight slowing. I strained my ears. The jingle of the harness seemed louder now, more pronounced in the oppressive quiet. I risked a peek through the side window. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing against the glass like a living thing. I could just make out Grissom's broad back. He was holding the reins, but he seemed almost relaxed. Too relaxed. For a man escorting a valuable target through the most dangerous stretch of road in the county, his posture was unnervingly casual. He leaned over and said something to Hawk, a low murmur lost to the wind. Hawk's shoulders tensed. That was when I noticed the smaller things, the details that didn't fit. Grissom had a second pistol tucked into his belt, one I hadn't seen before. It wasn't sheriff's issue. It was smaller, more easily concealed. And Hawk, who was supposed to be the sharpshooter, kept his rifle resting across his lap, not held at the ready. It was as if they weren't anticipating an attack at all. It was as if they were waiting for something else entirely. A prickle of cold fear, entirely separate from my fear of the highwayman, snaked its way up my spine. "They will keep you perfectly safe," my father had said, but his words now echoed in my mind with a hollow, sinister ring. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation I'd overheard a week ago, a slip of the tongue from Beatrice. She'd been speaking with one of her society friends, complaining about the costs of the manor's upkeep. If only Alistair had access to the Thorne maternal trust, she'd sighed, dabbing her lips with a napkin. But of course, that is all tied up for Alara's dowry. Untouchable. Unless, of course, the dear girl were to meet some unfortunate accident. At the time, I had dismissed it as her usual spiteful chatter. Now the words came back to me, sharp and venomous. Unfortunate accident. The carriage lurched to a halt. It was not a sudden, violent stop, but a controlled, deliberate one. My breath caught in my throat. I heard no shout, no warning, no gunshot, just an unnerving, profound silence. The fog outside swirled, and for a long moment, nothing happened. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. This was it, the moment the trap was supposed to spring. I pressed myself against the far side of the carriage, trying to make myself as small as possible. I heard a soft thud, as if someone had landed lightly on the packed earth. Then another, footsteps, quiet and measured, approached the carriage door. This wasn't the sound of a brutish thug, it was the sound of a predator, confident and silent. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the door to be wrenched open, for a gruff voice to demand my jewels. But the voice, when it came, was not what I expected. It was calm, low, and clear, cutting through the fog with an unnerving precision. And it wasn't directed at me. "You can drop the act, Grissom," the voice said. It came from just outside my window. "Your acting is as clumsy as your aim." I heard Grissom shift on the driver's box. "Shadow," he growled, his voice tight with something that sounded less like surprise and more like frustration. "You were supposed to wait until the Briarstone bend." My blood ran cold. Supposed to wait? What did he mean? "Plans change," the calm voice replied. "Especially when they're built on a foundation of lies. Tell me, what's Beatrice paying you for this little performance? Enough to soothe your conscience when you have to explain how the poor sheriff's daughter was tragically killed in the fray." The world tilted, the air in the carriage became thick, unbreathable. Every fear, every doubt, every unsettling detail of the morning coalesced into a single horrifying truth. This wasn't a trap for the shadow, it was a trap for me. The carriage door opened. A man stood there, silhouetted against the gray mist. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, practical leather that blended with the shadows of the forest. His face was partially obscured by a dark scarf, but his eyes were visible, and they were a startling, intelligent gray. They were not the eyes of a madman or a killer. They were the eyes of someone who saw everything. This was the shadow, Kalen. He ignored the men on the box, his attention fixed entirely on me. He saw the terror on my face, the dawning comprehension. His expression softened with something that looked almost like pity. "Grissom isn't here to protect you, girl," he said, his voice dropping so only I could hear it. "He's here to bury you." From the driver's box, I heard the click of a pistol hammer being cocked. Grissom's voice was laced with panic. "Now, Shadow, you've had your fun. Hand over the girl's things and be on your way." It was a pathetic attempt to salvage their script. Kalen didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on mine. "Your stepmother wants your inheritance. Your father wants the sympathy and political power that comes from being the grieving father of a martyred daughter. They hired these two to kill you and make it look like I did it. A tragic highwayman attack. Everyone wins, except you." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was monstrous. It was impossible. And yet I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was true. I saw it in Grissom's panicked expression. I saw it in the way Hawk refused to look down from the box, his shoulders hunched in shame. I saw it in the memory of my father's cold eyes and Beatrice's secret smile. "So," Kalan said softly, extending a gloved hand towards me, "you have a choice. You can stay in the pretty carriage and play your part in their tragedy, or you can come with me, and we can write a different ending to this story." Behind him, I saw Grissom begin to raise his pistol, his face a mask of murderous resolve. The performance was over. He was going to kill us both. There was no time to think. There was only instinct, the instinct to live. I took his hand. His grip was strong and sure. In one fluid motion, he pulled me from the carriage, swinging me behind him as a pistol shot cracked through the silent wood. The bullet splintered the carriage door where my head had been moments before. Kalen didn't flinch. With a speed that seemed inhuman, he drew his own pistol and fired not at Grissom, but at the carriage lamp beside him. It exploded in a shower of glass and oil. "Come on," he yelled, and a powerful black horse, which had been standing silently in the fog just a few feet away, trotted forward. He vaulted into the saddle and pulled me up behind him with an arm of steel. Another shot whizzed past my ear. Hawk hadn't fired. It was only Grissom, clumsy and panicked. "They won't follow," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "Their story requires them to be the survivors of a brutal attack. They'll wait an hour, then ride back to town with a tale of heroism and tragedy." He spurred the horse, and we plunged off the road, into the dense, untracked wilderness of the Whisperwood. The ornate carriage, the emerald dress, the lies, and the life I had known were all swallowed by the fog behind us. My arms were wrapped tightly around a stranger, a man my father had called a monster, but as the forest closed in around us, I knew he was the only person in the world I could trust. I was no longer Alara Thorne, the sheriff's daughter. I was a ghost, abducted by a shadow, running for my life from the real monsters. And for the first time that day, a strange, terrifying sense of freedom took root in my heart. The game had changed. I was no longer the bait. I was the one who had escaped the trap. The ride was a blur of chaotic motion and raw sensation. Branches whipped at my face and tore at the delicate silk of my dress, the fine garment shredding into ribbons around me. The emerald fabric, a symbol of my gilded cage, was being stripped away by the raw, untamed forest. My arms were locked around Kalen's waist, my face pressed against the rough leather of his coat, which smelled of pine needles, rain, and horse. His body was a solid, reassuring presence in a world that had just dissolved into madness. He navigated the dense woods with an instinctual skill, his horse moving as surely as if it were on a marked path, weaving through ancient trees and leaping over fallen logs. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his movements. He was as much a part of this forest as the fog and the shadows. My mind was a whirlwind of shock and grief. My own father, he had signed my death warrant. He had looked me in the eye and sent me to my executioners. The betrayal was a physical ache in my chest, so profound it was hard to breathe. Beatrice's venom. I had understood, in a way. I was a rival, a reminder of the woman who had held my father's heart before her. But my father, my own blood. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. Tears streamed from my eyes, mingling with the damp mist on my cheeks. But I made no sound. The time for weeping would come later. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. After what felt like an eternity, Kalen slowed the horse. We had descended into a small, hidden dell, so perfectly concealed by rocky outcrops and a thick canopy of leaves that it would be invisible from above or even a few yards away. A thin stream trickled over mossy rocks, and the air was still and quiet. A small smokeless fire burned in a stone-lined pit, and two makeshift shelters stood beneath the overhang of a large cliff face. It was a bandit's camp, but it was nothing like the sordid dens of storybooks. It was Spartan, yes, but also meticulously clean and organized. An older woman with hair the color of iron filings and a face etched with the lines of a hard life looked up from where she was sharpening a knife. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, widened slightly at the sight of me, then flickered to Kalen with a questioning look. A young boy, no older than 15, who was tending to two other horses, stopped his work and stared. "Mara," Kalen said, swinging down from the horse and then reaching up to help me. My legs were numb, and I nearly stumbled, but he caught me easily. "This is Alara. She'll be staying with us for a while." Her travel plans changed rather unexpectedly. His tone was calm, matter-of-fact, but Mara's eyes were full of understanding. She looked at my ruined dress, my tear-streaked face, and the terror in my eyes, and her stern expression softened into one of compassion. "Well, get the girl out of that ridiculous thing before she freezes," she said, her voice raspy but not unkind. "There's a stew on the fire. You both look like you could use it." She disappeared into one of the shelters and returned a moment later with a bundle of worn but clean clothes, a simple woolen tunic, breeches, and a thick cloak. She pressed them into my hands. "The stream is cold, but it'll wash away the road. We'll burn the dress." It was a symbolic gesture, and I understood it immediately. We were burning the evidence, burning the old me. While I changed behind a screen of blankets Mara had rigged, I could hear Kalen speaking to her in low tones, explaining the situation. I emerged, feeling less like a porcelain doll and more like a person, the rough wool a comforting weight on my skin. Kalen handed me a wooden bowl of hot stew. It was simple fare, just root vegetables and some kind of wild game, but it was the most welcome meal I had ever eaten. We sat by the fire, the initial shock beginning to recede, replaced by 1,000 burning questions. "How?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. "How did you know?" Kalen stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "The world is built on whispers, Alara. You just have to know how to listen." He explained that he had a network of informants, people in the towns and villages who were overlooked and ignored, stable hands, kitchen maids, blacksmith apprentices, people who saw and heard everything. One of your stepmother's maids, a girl named Rose, her family was one of the first I ever helped, years ago, when a corrupt taxman tried to seize their farm. She never forgot it. She has been loyal to your mother's memory, not to Beatrice. When she heard Beatrice and your father planning this, she found a way to get a message to me. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a random act of mercy, it was a calculated intervention. He had known the plan all along. My father, I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. He gets the glory of a martyred daughter. The county will rally around him. Beatrice gets the inheritance. But what about you? You become a murderer in their story. They'll hunt you with everything they have. They were already hunting me, he said with a wry, humorless smile. The stakes have just gotten higher, and as for the story they'll tell, stories can be rewritten. He met my gaze, his gray eyes serious. They think you are a pawn in their game, Alara, fragile and easily sacrificed. What they don't know is that the pawn is sometimes the most powerful piece on the board. It can cross to the other side and become a queen. His words sent a shiver through me. But it was not of fear, it was a flicker of something else. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. A spark of anger, of defiance. He was right. They had underestimated me my entire life. My father had seen me as a disappointment, a quiet, bookish girl who lacked the ruthless ambition he valued. Beatrice had seen me as an obstacle. They both saw me as weak. Perhaps it was time I proved them wrong. The days that followed were a strange education. Life in the hidden dell was governed by the rhythms of survival. I learned how to bank a fire so it wouldn't produce smoke, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones under Mara's tutelage, how to mend my own clothes, and how to move silently through the undergrowth. The pampered sheriff's daughter was slowly being stripped away, revealing someone tougher, more resilient underneath. Kalen became my reluctant teacher. He saw the fire in my eyes that first night, the raw anger that was starting to burn away the grief, and he decided to nurture it. He began with awareness. He would take me to the edge of the dell and make me simply sit, listen, and watch. He taught me to distinguish the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof from one under a man's boot, to read the meaning in a sudden flight of birds, to understand the language of the forest. Then came the lessons in self-defense. He gave me a small, perfectly balanced dagger. "I hope you never have to use this," he said, showing me how to hold it, how to stand, how to use an attacker's weight and momentum against them. But hope is not a strategy. You will learn to protect yourself. The training was grueling. My muscles ached in ways I never knew possible. I was clumsy at first, my movements hesitant, but I was a determined student. Every lunge, every parry, every fall to the dirt was fueled by the memory of my father's betrayal. Kalon was a patient instructor, his critiques sharp but fair. During those lessons, the space between us began to shrink. The highwayman and the lady became just Kalon and Alara. I learned his story in fragments, offered up during quiet moments by the fire. His real name was Kalon. His family had been landowners, respected and fair, until a powerful magistrate, a cousin of Beatrice's as it turned out, had coveted their land. He had fabricated charges of treason against Kalon's father, seizing his property and sentencing him to a labor camp from which he never returned. Kalon, then just a boy, had escaped with nothing but a thirst for a justice the law would not provide. He didn't steal for greed. He stole to survive and to undermine the corrupt network of officials, like the magistrate and my father, who preyed on the weak. He was a man living by a strict code in a lawless world. In turn, I told him about my life, about the loneliness that had settled in after my mother's death, a silence that filled every corner of the grand house. I told him about my father's slow withdrawal, his transformation from a loving parent into a cold, ambitious official. I spoke of Beatrice's quiet campaign of emotional cruelty, the constant subtle dismissals that had eroded my sense of self-worth for years. Sharing these stories, I realized how much I had accepted, how much I had normalized. The cage had been built around me so slowly, I hadn't even realized I was a prisoner. One evening, as he was showing me how to bind a wound, our hands brushed. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between us. I looked up and met his gaze. In his eyes I saw not a fearsome outlaw, but a man who understood loss, who knew the sting of injustice. And I think he saw in me not a helpless damsel, but a survivor, someone who had been bent but not broken. The bond between us was no longer just one of a protector and his charge. It was a bond of mutual respect, forged in shared trauma, and a common enemy. A week after my abduction, the young boy, Finn, who acted as Kalen's scout, returned from town with news. The county was in an uproar. Sheriff Thorne had given a heart-wrenching performance, declaring his beloved daughter presumed dead at the hands of the monstrous Shadow. He had wept before the town council, vowing to hunt the villain to the ends of the earth. Beatrice, dressed in black, was the picture of tragic grief. A massive posse had been formed, combing the Whisperwood, though Kaylin assured me they were looking in all the wrong places. The most chilling news was that my father had petitioned the magistrate Beatrice's cousin for an expedited settlement of my mother's estate, citing the need for funds to equip his expanded force of deputies. The legal gears were already turning to transfer my inheritance to him and Beatrice. They were not even waiting for a body to be found. The news settled in my gut like a stone. My grief, which had been a wild, sharp thing, was now cooling, hardening into something else. Rage. Cold, clear, and focused. "They can't be allowed to get away with this," I said, my voice low and steady. I looked at Kaylin, my eyes meeting his across the flickering firelight. Hiding isn't enough. Running isn't enough. I want them exposed. I want everyone to know what they did. A slow smile spread across Kaylin's face. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him, and it transformed his entire demeanor, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been in another life. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "Grief is a storm, Ilara. You can let it drown you, or you can learn to sail. It's time we planned our voyage." And so we began to plot. We were two ghosts. A highwayman declared a murderer and a girl declared a victim. But we were going to haunt the people who had tried to bury us. We would not be specters of vengeance, we would be agents of truth. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and likely to get us both killed. But the thought of my father and stepmother succeeding, of them building their new life on the foundations of my death, was a fate worse than any risk we could take. We would not just survive, we would turn their own trap back on them, and ensure that when the dust settled, the whole world knew who the real monsters were. Our plan required two things: irrefutable proof and a perfect stage. The proof, we reasoned, existed in two forms. The first was the testimony of a guilty man, Hawk. I remembered his averted eyes, his hunched shoulders. He was a man drowning in his conscience, a weak link in my father's chain. The second, more tangible proof, would be the correspondence. Beatrice was meticulous, but she was also arrogant. She would have kept the letters from the corrupt banker who was facilitating the transfer of my inheritance, seeing them as trophies of her cleverness. The stage had to be a place where the maximum number of influential people would be gathered, a place where a revelation would be so public and so shocking that it could not be suppressed or denied. Finn, our young scout, brought us the perfect opportunity. He returned from his next trip to town with a poster, his eyes wide with the audacity of it all. Sheriff Thorne was hosting a memorial gala for the Ilara Thorne Public Safety Fund. It was a grand affair, designed to cement his image as the grieving father and solicit donations from the county's wealthiest citizens to fund his private war against the criminal element. It was to be held in 2 weeks at our family manor. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was throwing a party to celebrate my death in the very house where I had grown up. "He's building his legacy on my grave," I whispered, tracing the elegant script of my own name on the poster. "Then we shall ensure it is his legacy that gets buried there instead," Kaylin replied, his voice a low growl. The next 2 weeks were a blur of intense preparation. Kaylin drilled me relentlessly, not just with the dagger, but in the arts of stealth and disguise. Mara worked her own kind of magic, transforming a drab servant's uniform Finn had procured into a garment that would fit me perfectly, altering it in subtle ways so it wouldn't seem brand new. She taught me how to walk and carry myself like a servant, to be invisible in plain sight, to keep my eyes downcast, to fade into the background. Meanwhile, Kaylan and his small band were making plans of their own. The night of the gala, they would create a series of diversions: a fire at an old abandoned mill on the east side of the county, a report of a stagecoach robbery to the west. The goal was to draw the bulk of my father's deputies away from the manor, leaving only a skeleton crew and the private security he'd hired for the event. As the day of the gala approached, a cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I would be walking back into the lion's den, into the home that was no longer a home. I would have to face the ghosts of my past and the monsters of my present. One evening, my nerve almost broke. I sat staring into the fire, my hands trembling. Kalen came and sat beside me, his presence a quiet comfort. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me not to be afraid. Instead, he said, "Fear is a tool, Ilara. It sharpens your senses. It keeps you alive. Don't fight it. Use it. Let it remind you what you're fighting for." He placed his hand over mine. His touch was warm and steady, a silent promise that I was not alone. The night of the gala arrived, cloaked in a cold, starless sky. We rode to the edge of the estate, the sounds of music and laughter drifting faintly on the wind. It was a grotesque symphony, a celebration of my own demise. Dressed in the drab gray uniform, with my hair tucked under a severe cap, I was unrecognizable. I was just another shadow in the night. Mara and Finn will be waiting for you at the old hunter's cabin by the river when you're done, Kalen said, his voice a low murmur. He was disguised as well, dressed in the fine but understated clothes of a visiting merchant, his hair altered, a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He looked respectable, scholarly even. He would be my eyes and ears inside, ready to intervene if things went wrong. What if I can't do it? I whispered, the fear a living thing in my throat. He took my chin in his hand, forcing me to meet his gaze. His gray eyes were fierce. You can. Remember who you are. You are the daughter of the woman who taught you the names of the wild flowers. You are the survivor of the Whisperwood. You are the storm. Now go. With a final nod, I slipped through a gap in the stone wall and melted into the sprawling gardens of the manor. The place was both achingly familiar and horribly alien. I knew every stone path, every rose bush, but now they felt like parts of a hostile landscape. I made my way to the servants' entrance at the back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As I'd hoped, the chaos of the gala meant no one paid any mind to a new face. I was just another harried servant, and I was waved through into the bustling heat of the kitchens, carrying a tray of empty glasses as a prop. I moved out into the manor proper. The sheer hypocrisy of the scene stole my breath away. The grand ballroom was filled with the county's elite, all dressed in their finest. My father stood near the great fireplace, accepting condolences, his face a perfect mask of solemn grief. Beatrice was at his side, a black diamond necklace glittering at her throat, looking every bit the tragic, beautiful widow of a man's dreams. They were magnificent actors. The sight filled me not with sadness, but with a glacial rage that solidified my resolve. My first target was Hawk. I knew from my time at the manor that the guards often took their breaks in the cool darkness of the wine cellar. I found him there, just as I'd predicted, slumped on a crate, a half-empty bottle of brandy in his hand. He looked haggard, haunted. I stepped out of the shadows. "Hello, Hawk," I said softly. He sprang to his feet, his eyes wide with terror as he recognized me. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Miss Thorne, you're supposed to be dead." "I'm not," I said, my voice even. "No thanks to you and Grissom, or my father." He started to stammer, to deny it, but his guilt was written all over his face. I held up a hand to stop him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I remembered Kalen's advice. Find the liver. I knew Hawk had a young daughter, a little girl named Lily with bright red hair. "I remember you used to bring Lily to the summer fair," I said quietly. "She must be 6 years old now. You love her more than anything, don't you? You would do anything to protect her." Tears welled in his eyes. "Yes," he choked out. "Then you know how a father is supposed to feel," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "My father sent me out to be murdered for money. He threw me away. Is that the kind of man you want to protect? Is his blood money worth the price of your soul? What will you tell Lily when she's old enough to understand what you did?" He broke. Sobs racked his body, and he sank back onto the crate. "I never wanted," Grissom said. "It would be quick, that no one would know." "People will know," I promised him. "And you have a choice. You can hang alongside them, or you can tell the truth and save yourself. Tell me where she keeps the letters." He confessed everything. Beatrice, in a fit of supreme and arrogant irony, kept her most private documents in a small wall safe hidden behind the portrait of my mother that still hung in my father's study. It was a final, daily insult to the woman she had replaced. Hawk agreed to testify to the visiting magistrate, a man known for his integrity, who was in attendance tonight. I had my first piece of the puzzle. Now for the second. I made my way upstairs to the study. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was just as I remembered, smelling of leather and polish, a monument to my father's ambition. And there, over the mantelpiece, was the portrait of my mother. She was painted in the garden, smiling, her eyes full of the life that had been so brutally extinguished. Looking at her gave me strength. It took me a few precious moments, but I found the hidden catch. The portrait swung inward, revealing the small iron safe. It was locked, of course, but Kalen and I had planned for this. Beatrice's vanity was her weakness. The combination, Hawk had whispered, was a date of significance to her. Not her wedding anniversary, but the date her first husband, a wealthy old man, had died. making her a rich widow. It was a date I knew. With trembling fingers, I turned the dial. The lock clicked open. Inside was a small leather portfolio, and inside that, a stack of letters, tied with a black ribbon. I read the first line of the top letter, written in the banker's spidery script. My dearest Beatrice, a pleasure to confirm the arrangements. Once the girl is disposed of by the highwayman, the funds from the maternal trust will be transferred to an account of your choosing. I had it. The proof. My heart soared. I tucked the portfolio into my apron and turned to leave. And I walked directly into the barrel-chested form of Grissom. His small eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into slits of pure malice. Well, well, he sneered, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Look what the cat dragged in. The ghost of Ilara Thorne. He lunged for me. All of Kalen's training took over. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. As he reached for me, I dropped low, just as we'd practiced, and drove the heel of my boot into his knee. He roared in pain and surprise. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to give me a precious second. I didn't run for the door. I darted deeper into the study, putting the heavy oak desk between us. He limped after me, his face contorted with rage. You should have stayed dead, you little witch. Just as he rounded the desk, the study door opened again. It was Kalen, in his merchant's disguise. He held a glass of brandy in one hand and looked at the scene with an air of mild surprise. Pardon me, he said to Grissom, his voice polite. I seem to be lost. I was looking for the card room. Grissom, momentarily confused by the interruption, hesitated. It was the only opening Kalen needed. He moved with a speed that belied his scholarly appearance. The brandy glass was dropped, and in a flash he had Grissom's arm twisted behind his back, a wicked-looking blade pressed to his throat. The card game is over, Grissom, Kalen hissed, his voice losing all its feigned politeness. And you have lost. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. Go, Ilara, now, finish it. I didn't wait. I clutched the letters and ran from the room, down the grand staircase, and straight into the ballroom. The orchestra was playing a waltz. The couple spun and laughed. It was a scene from a dream, a beautiful, perfect lie, and I was about to shatter it forever. I walked to the center of the room, directly in front of the orchestra dais. I waited until my father noticed me. His eyes, which had been crinkling in a smile as he spoke to the magistrate, slowly widened. The color drained from his face. Beatrice followed his gaze, and when she saw me, her wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the polished floor. The music faltered and died. A hush fell over the entire ballroom. Every eye in the room was on me, the ghost. I did not shout. I did not weep. I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of my impossible presence sink in. Then, I held up the leather portfolio. My voice, when I spoke, was not the whisper of a frightened girl. It was the clear, cold, steady voice of a woman who had been to hell and returned. Good evening, Father. Beatrice, I said. I apologize for interrupting your party, but I felt you should know that reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. My father found his voice, sputtering. Ilara, what is the meaning of this? Seize her. She is clearly hysterical. I am not hysterical, I said calmly, opening the portfolio. I am, however, in possession of some very interesting correspondence. I looked directly at Beatrice, whose face was a mask of pure, murderous fury. This is a letter from your banker, Beatrice. It's dated 2 weeks ago. Shall I read it aloud? It begins, My dearest Beatrice, a pleasure to confirm the arrangements. Once the girl is disposed of by the highwayman, the funds from the maternal trust will be transferred. A collective gasp swept through the room. The facade had cracked. My father lunged toward me, his face purple with rage, but the magistrate stepped in his path, his expression grim. Let her finish, Sheriff, the magistrate commanded. And then, the final piece of our plan fell into place. From the back of the room, a voice cried out. She's telling the truth. All heads turned. It was Hawk, his face pale but resolute, pushing his way through the stunned crowd. I was there. The sheriff and his wife, they paid us to kill her, to make it look like the shadow did it. It was over. The lie was dead. The beautiful party had become a courtroom, and the accused stood exposed for all to see. My father stood frozen, his reputation, his ambition, his entire world crumbling into dust around him. Beatrice let out a sound like a cornered animal, a shriek of pure, impotent rage. The chaos had begun. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. not with the swing of a sword, but with the quiet, undeniable power of the truth. In the pandemonium that erupted, everything moved in a strange, slow clarity. The magistrate, a man whose stern reputation was well earned, immediately took command. He motioned to two of his own clerks, who were also guests, to act as witnesses. "Sheriff Thorne, madam," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed my father's. "You are both under arrest, pending a full inquiry into these most serious allegations." My father seemed to shrink before my eyes. The towering figure of my childhood, the man of unbending will and iron control, dissolved into a pale, trembling man. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, desperate, as if searching for some flicker of the obedient daughter he had cast away. He found none. I met his gaze with nothing but the cold, hard finality of his own making. Beatrice, on the other hand, was all fire and venom. She spat curses, her carefully constructed mask of gentility shattering to reveal the ugly, grasping greed beneath. As the magistrate's men, assisted by a few of the more honorable town council members, took my father and Beatrice into custody, another figure emerged from the crowd. Kalen, his merchant disguise now irrelevant, stepped forward. He gave the briefest of nods to the magistrate, an acknowledgement between two men who, despite being on opposite sides of the law, understood a higher form of justice. "It seems the shadow of the past has done this county a service," the magistrate said, his eyes shrewdly assessing Kalen. "Though your methods are unconventional, the most direct path is not always a straight one," Kalen replied simply. He looked at me, a quick, meaningful glance that said, "It is done." Then, before anyone could think to stop him, he slipped back into the chaos of the crowd and was gone, vanishing as mysteriously as he had appeared. I did not stay to watch the full implosion of my former life. I handed the portfolio of letters to the magistrate, my hands steady. "This is everything you will need," I said. My part in this was over. As the guests began to babble, their shock turning into a fever of delicious gossip, I walked out of the ballroom, away from the wreckage of the Thorne name, and did not look back. I slipped out the same servant's entrance I had used to enter, a ghost leaving the scene of her own haunting. I found my way to the hunter's cabin by the river, as the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. A fire was burning, and Mara was waiting for me. She enveloped me in a rough, comforting hug, smelling of wood smoke and herbs. "You did it, girl," she whispered. "You brought the whole rotten tree down." A short while later, Kalen arrived. He was no longer a merchant, but the shadow once more. We stood by the river's edge, the water rushing over the smooth stones, the only sound in the quiet morning. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, his gaze distant, fixed on the far bank. "My work here is done. They will no longer be hunting a murderer. The story has changed, but they will still hunt the shadow. It is time for me to find a new forest, new shadows to inhabit." My heart sank. A part of me, a part I hadn't dared to acknowledge until this very moment, had hoped for a different ending, an ending where our paths did not have to diverge. "You're leaving," I said. It wasn't a question. "My path is a lonely one, Alara," he said gently, turning to face me. "It is not a life for you. You have a chance now to build something new, something real, in the light." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. He pressed it into my palm. It was a small bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of dark wood, its wings outstretched, as if in mid-flight. A sparrow. "You are not the bait in anyone's trap anymore," he said, his fingers brushing mine one last time. "You are free. You did this. You saved yourself." I just held the door open. He stepped back, gave me one last, long look, a look that held a world of unspoken things. Then he turned, and with the same silent grace with which he had entered my life, he walked into the woods and was gone. I stood there clutching the wooden bird, the tears I had held back for so long finally falling, not for the family I had lost, but for the ally I had found, and the future I now had to face alone. The trial was the talk of the state. It was swift and damning. Hawke's testimony, combined with the irrefutable evidence in Beatrice's letters, left no room for doubt. My father, a broken man, offered no defense. Beatrice fought, her lawyers attempting to paint me as a hysterical, vengeful liar. But the truth was too solid to be dismantled. They were both found guilty. My father was sentenced to life in the state penitentiary for conspiracy to commit murder. Beatrice, for her role as the mastermind, was sentenced to hang. My inheritance was restored to me. Suddenly, I was a woman of considerable means. The manor, the money, the land, It was all mine, but I found I wanted none of it. The house was not a home, it was a mausoleum of bad memories. So I sold it, along with all its opulent furnishings. I kept only two things, the portrait of my mother and the small wooden sparrow Kaylin had given me. With the proceeds, I moved away from the county that bore my tainted name. I started over. I knew I couldn't live Kaylin's life, a life on the fringes, but I could honor his spirit. I could fight for the kind of justice he believed in. But from within the system, I used my inheritance to establish a foundation, one dedicated to providing legal aid to those who, like his family, had been wronged by the rich and powerful. I sought out the best, most honest lawyers and investigators, and we went to work, fighting corrupt officials and greedy landowners, not with swords and pistols, but with writs and evidence. We became our own kind of shadow, working quietly in the background to bring secrets into the light. Years passed. My life became full, purposeful. I found a quiet joy in my work, in the small victories we won for ordinary people. The name Alara Thorne, once synonymous with scandal and tragedy, slowly became associated with integrity and hope. I only saw my father one more time. About 5 years after the trial, I went to the state penitentiary. I needed to see him, not for his sake, but for mine. He was brought into the visitor's room, a stooped, gray man in a coarse uniform. The unbending authority was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed shame. We sat in silence for a long time, the thick glass between us, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had always existed. He finally looked at me, his voice a dry rasp. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "I know," I said, and I realized, to my surprise, that I felt no hatred, only a profound and weary pity for a man who had traded his daughter's life for a handful of ambition and had lost everything. I did not say I forgave him. Some things cannot be forgiven, but I told him I hoped he could find a way to forgive himself. I stood up and walked away, and I felt the last chain of my old life fall away. I was finally truly free. I never saw Kaylin again, but sometimes, years apart, I would hear whispers. A story in a newspaper from a distant territory, about a corrupt shipping magnate mysteriously exposed. A rumor from a traveling merchant about a cruel factory owner whose hidden ledgers suddenly appeared on the steps of the courthouse. I never knew for certain if it was him, but I liked to think it was. I liked to think that the shadow was still out there, balancing the scales in his own way. Sometimes I would receive an anonymous letter, containing nothing but a pressed wildflower from a region I had never visited, a sign, I believed, that he remembered me too. The small wooden sparrow has sat on my desk every day for 26 years. It is a constant reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there can be honor, and that the strongest cages are the ones we allow to be built around us. It reminds me that a sparrow is not just a small, fragile bird, it is also a survivor, meant to fly. So that's my story. That's how I learned that your worth is not determined by the family you are born into, but by the choices you make when you are tested. They thought I was a pawn, but they forgot that a pawn that makes it all the way to the other side of the board can change the entire game. The greatest revenge wasn't seeing my father and stepmother fall, it was my refusal to be destroyed by their betrayal. It was in the act of living and living well. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. It's not an easy story to tell, but I believe in the power of sharing our truths. Have you ever had to completely redefine your life after a betrayal? Share your story in the comments below, because every story shared makes us all feel a little less alone. Please don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories of survival and resilience. Remember, you are stronger than you think, and your life is your own story to write. Thank you for being here with me. I wish you all strength on your own paths.